Welcome to part one of chapter 5 on qualitative methods. Okay, this is my wheelhouse. Qualitative methods is my big passion. It's what I write about a lot. It's what I use to do my research, with a few exceptions. I do some mixed methods work sometimes, but I am very passionate about this. I'm going to use one example throughout as I explain concepts in this chapter, and that is of an extended ethnography that I did for about 2.5 years in a clinic that took care of older people over the age of 65 who had a cancer diagnosis, and they used an interdisciplinary team. So there was a doctor, of course, an oncologist, but there's also a registered dietitian, clinical social worker, clinical pharmacist, and registered nurse. And all of these people work together to take care of these patients. And I did an ethnography of their behavior, both with patients and sort of behind the scenes, what's called the backstage. I'm going to talk about a lot of these concepts using that example. Okay, so reality is socially constructed according to qualitative researchers, right? Meaning, yes, there is a real, objects out there, but the meaning that they take on is something that we construct together. This is called intersubjectivity, right? There's some common assumptions, common ideas that we can identify, whether we agree with them or not. And from this perspective, right, your book calls it subjectivity. I would call it intersubjectivity, right? That subjectivity focuses on the unique ways that we each make sense of the world. We each have a somewhat different point of view, right? I would argue they're not completely out of left field for the most part, however, that there are real common shared understandings that we have. However, I absolutely 100% agree with what your book states when they say that the researcher is the research instrument, right? We are literally how data comes into and how it's analyzed, and there's no sort of well, there can be software involved, but there's no statistics mediating it, right? Or no valid measures that have already been set up that you're using to do these kinds of measurement. Instead, you are taking all the impressions and perceptions in through your personal point of view. And this is an inductive. I spent a lot of time studying them, doing field notes, and then later doing interviews. And those field notes led me to have lots of interactions that I then worked from to develop a conclusion, some arguments about interdisciplinary healthcare teamwork, and also to propose a theoretical, not always a whole theory, but theoretical assumptions. Mine was about the idea of embedded teamwork, that most of it doesn't actually happen in the formal meetings. It happens in groups of one, of two, and three outside of the meetings more than it does. Okay, how do qualitative methodologists construct knowledge? We describe richly, very deep understanding. So you learned in my work a lot about that one healthcare team, and things that they do. And I followed them around for 2.5 years so I could say, listen, this is what they do all day long, right? Not just have them fill out a measure of some kind of their behavior or their own perceptions, but I spent a lot of time actually watching them. This has to do not with validity and reliability, which is very important. That's about measurement. That's a quantitative thing. Instead, we have credibility. Like, are we doing a credible job? And that involves veracity, meaning, are we being truthful? Are we doing our best to get down the details? And are we getting them down as accurately as possible in our field notes, in our interviews, and so on? Knowledge is therefore created through this intersubjective agreement, right? That I'm interacting with my participants and I'm running ideas by them, and I'm asking them informal questions during informal interviews as we're hanging out, and I'm watching them and then asking them questions about what they did and what it meant to them, right? And I also had these more formal interviews. So we're creating meaning together. And then once I publish things, I'm co-creating meanings based on what other people have published, and then they read my work and it influences theirs as well. This is usually done, qualitative methodology, in a naturalistic setting, meaning you could study, the library at Santa Clara or Benson, studying how students behave in there, but it's a naturally occurring place that they would go. It's not an artificially set up environment. And that natural environment, you're going to have a specific kind of relationship. In my case, I was a long-term cancer survivor. I'm a 36-year survivor of a form of bone cancer that I had when I was a sophomore in college. I have lived with a lot of what are called late effects. There are problems that I have that, even though I survived, which I'm profoundly grateful, I live with chronic illnesses and problems and mobility problems that come from the cancer and its treatment. And that point of view that I have, that embodied standpoint, and the values that that's led me to embrace, cannot be separated from the research. And I don't try to pretend. I think it's far more rigorous to be very honest and open and reflective, really think about, yes, am I more sympathetic to the patients and the healthcare providers? Maybe, right? And what would that mean? And how do I need to pay attention to that? The fact that I know a lot of the vocabulary and don't have to ask questions about that means my brain is free to work on some other things, right? And maybe paying attention to other things. We don't apologize for having an embodied standpoint in qualitative research. We are instead think about it very carefully. In the traditions of qualitative research, your book goes far deeper than I think is necessary. Please skip the entire hermeneutics section. And then in phenomenology, don't read the beginning on Husserl, just skip down to the Schultz section about social phenomenology. And this is the idea that we each are encountering people and events and communication all day long, and we're forming our own personal subjective view of the world, right? And that this is done through what are called typifications, meaning the values and beliefs and ideas that are developed through the interaction that I have locally, but it doesn't mean that quite literally. It means within the cultures that I move in. University culture, national scholars I hang out with at conferences and stuff, my own family and friends, network, right? The ways I do it, same thing that you would do. Those develop and called typifications. We have to consider carefully how and why biases develop, both in participants and in researchers. There is unconscious bias. There are real things that we've come to see as quote unquote normal and other things we're not, something we have more experience with. My perspective as a Gen X is very different than yours as Gen Z. And when I was studying these older folks and their healthcare providers, I was about the same age as many of them had grandchildren my age. Some of them had children, but more of them were grandchildren my age. And it definitely affected. My grandparents were on one side were still alive, and I was still, it sort of affected the way in which I was able to understand them. This understanding is always ongoing, right? And it always involves the researcher. Lastly, a school of thought that's important as well as phenomenology to understanding the current way in which we do qualitative research is symbolic interactionism. And this is the idea that symbols, that's language, interaction, that's us communicating with each other, right? Whether interpersonally in small groups or organizations or nationally, or in culture. All those ways of communicating uses symbols, right? And that leads to cultural meanings and it reflects cultural meanings. There's an interplay, says symbolic interactionism, between the way in which we think, the way in which we as a self interact with others, and then with the larger societal context, right? We do things influenced by culture, and then what we do then influences the culture in small ways. And all of these things, and people we communicate with and ways we communicate, influence how we think. These meanings are always flexible, they're always changing over time, they don't stay static.